Ryan Carter shoved past Sophia Chun so hard that her shoulders slammed into the concrete wall of the training compound. Her old backpack flew from her grip and landed in a puddle of muddy water. The other recruits standing nearby burst out laughing, that sharp cutting sound that echoes through every military base where egos run wild. Sophia didn't cry out or complain. She just bent down slowly, picked up her dripping backpack, and kept walking like nothing had happened. Her silence made them laugh even harder. Jessica Monroe stood with her arms crossed, her auburn hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. She looked Sophia up and down with disgust written all over her face. Seriously, who approved this? Jessica said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Did they run out of actual soldiers and start letting in volunteers from the homeless shelter? The group around her howled with laughter. Someone pulled out their phone and started recording. This was their entertainment for the morning, watching the weird girl in worn-out clothes try to fit in where she clearly didn't belong. Sophia wore a faded gray hoodie that had holes in the elbows and cargo pants that looked like they'd been washed 1,000 times. Her sneakers were so beaten up that the rubber soles were separating from the fabric. She carried herself like someone who was used to being invisible, someone who had learned long ago that the best way to survive was to stay quiet and keep moving. Nobody at this elite military training facility would have guessed that she came from one of the most powerful families in the armed forces. Her father was a decorated general. Her mother had served in special operations for 15 years. But Sophia didn't carry any of that with her. No expensive gear, no confident swagger, just plain features and clothes that looked like they'd been pulled from a donation bin. Major Harrison stood at the front of the formation, his massive frame casting a shadow across the training yard. He was the kind of man whose voice could stop a fight before it started, and whose reputation made even cocky young recruits think twice before stepping out of line. He scanned the group of new arrivals with sharp eyes, sizing each one up like a predator, choosing which animal to chase first. When his gaze landed on Sophia, his expression shifted to confusion mixed with irritation. "You there," he barked, pointing directly at her. "What's your name, and why do you look like you just crawled out of a dumpster?" The question wasn't meant to be funny, but the recruits treated it like a comedy show. They snickered and elbowed each other, all eyes turning to watch Sophia's reaction. She stood perfectly still, her face showing no emotion at all. "Sophia Chun, sir," she said in a voice so quiet that people had to strain to hear her. "I'm here for basic combat training." Major Harrison walked closer, his boots making heavy thuds against the concrete. He stopped right in front of her and looked down with narrowed eyes. "Combat training?" He repeated the words like they were a joke. "You sure you're not looking for the cafeteria? We need dishwashers, not soldiers." More laughter rippled through the group. Sophia met his gaze without flinching, without showing any sign that his words bothered her. "I'm a recruit, sir," she said simply. Major Harrison shook his head and waved her off like she was an annoying fly. "Get in line, then. Try not to slow everyone else down." The first meal in the dining hall that evening turned into another stage for humiliation. Sophia carried her tray to an empty corner table, away from the loud conversations and bragging contests happening everywhere else. The room buzzed with recruits swapping stories about their accomplishments, their voices growing louder as they tried to outdo each other. Marcus Williams, a lean guy with a buzz cut and an attitude that filled the room, spotted her sitting alone. He grabbed his tray and walked over, dropping it on her table with a deliberate crash that made nearby tables turn to watch. "Hey, lost girl," Marcus said, his voice pitched perfectly to carry across the entire dining hall. "You sure you're not supposed to be cleaning tables instead of sitting at them?" The group behind him erupted in laughter. Sophia paused with her fork halfway to her mouth and looked at him with steady brown eyes. "I'm eating," she said in that same quiet voice. Marcus leaned in closer, a smirk spreading across his face. "Yeah, well, eat somewhere else. You're taking up space that real soldiers need." Without warning, he flicked the edge of her tray, sending a spoonful of mashed potatoes flying across her hoodie. The room exploded with laughter. Phones came out instantly, recording the moment for social media glory. But Sophia just reached for a napkin, wiped the mess with slow, careful movements, and took another bite like Marcus wasn't even there. Her deliberate calm seemed to make him angrier than any comeback could have. He stood there for a moment, waiting for some kind of reaction, but when nothing came, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath about weirdos who didn't belong. Physical training the next morning was designed to separate the strong from the weak. Push-ups until arms shook, sprints that burned lungs, burpees in the dirt under a blazing sun. Sophia kept pace, her breathing steady and controlled, but her shoelaces kept coming loose. They were old and frayed, barely holding her sneakers together. During a sprint, Ryan Carter jogged up beside her. Ryan was the group's golden boy, broad-shouldered with a grin that said he'd never lost at anything in his life and didn't plan to start now. "Yo, thrift store," he called out loud enough for the whole line to hear. "Your shoes falling apart, or is that just you?" Laughter rippled through the group like a wave. Sophia didn't respond. She simply knelt down, retied her laces with quick, precise fingers, and stood back up. But as she did, Ryan bumped her shoulder hard enough to send her stumbling forward. Her hands hit the gravel, knees scraping against rough stones. The group howled with delight, some of them slapping Ryan on the back like he'd just scored a winning goal. Sophia pushed herself up from the gravel, brushing small rocks from her scraped palms. Blood mixed with dirt on her skin, but she didn't wipe it away. She just resumed running without a word, her face showing no pain, no anger, nothing at all. The laughter followed her for the rest of the morning, echoing in her ears with every step she took. If it affected her, she didn't let it show. During the water break, she sat on a wooden bench away from everyone else, pulling a granola bar from her bag with hands that trembled just slightly. Jessica sauntered over with two other recruits, her arms crossed, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Sophia, right? So where you even from? Did you win some kind of lottery to be here?" Her friends giggled behind their hands like it was all too funny to contain. Sophia took a bite of her granola bar, chewed slowly, and looked up. "I applied," she said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact, like she was stating the weather forecast. Jessica's smile tightened into something sharper. "Okay, but why?" she pressed, leaning in closer. "You don't exactly look like soldier material. I mean, look at your everything." She waved a dismissive hand at Sophia's muddy hoodie and plain brown hair tied back with a rubber band. Sophia set her granola bar down and leaned forward just enough to make Jessica flinch backward. "I'm here to train," she said quietly, "not to make you feel better about yourself." Jessica froze, her cheeks turning red. "Whatever," she muttered, turning away quickly. "Weirdo." But as she walked away, something flickered in Sophia's eyes, just for a moment. Not anger, not hurt, but something colder and more calculating. She finished her granola bar in silence, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The navigation exercise that afternoon was designed to be brutal. Recruits had to cross a forested area, map in hand, under a strict time limit. Survival of the fittest, military style. Sophia moved alone through the trees, her compass steady in her hand, her steps quiet against fallen leaves. A group of 4 recruits, led by Tyler Jackson, spotted her checking her map under a large pine tree. Tyler was wiry and ambitious, the type who had been competing with Ryan for attention since day one, and saw Sophia as an easy target to impress his friends. "Hey, Girl Scout," he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet forest air. "You lost already? Or are you just out here looking for pretty flowers?" His group laughed, circling closer like wolves sensing weakness. Sophia folded her map with careful fingers and kept walking, her boots crunching softly on pine needles. But Tyler wasn't done performing for his audience. He jogged up and snatched the compass from her hands. "Let's see how you do without this," he said, smashing it against a rock with dramatic flair. The plastic casing cracked open, the needle spinning uselessly before falling still. The others cheered and pulled out their phones again, recording what they thought would be another humiliation for their entertainment. Sophia stopped walking and looked at the broken compass pieces scattered on the ground. She looked at Tyler, her face completely blank, and said, "Hope you know your way back." Then she turned and kept moving, her pace unchanged, like losing essential navigation equipment was just another minor problem to solve. Tyler's laughter faltered slightly, but his group kept jeering, their voices echoing through the trees as she disappeared deeper into the forest. Back at the barracks that night, Sophia sat on her narrow bunk, carefully examining the scrapes on her palms. She pulled out a small first aid kit from her bag and began cleaning the wounds with steady hands. The other recruits were gathered at the far end of the room, talking loudly about their day, comparing stories about who had done the best during training. Nobody looked in her direction. Nobody asked if she was okay. She was invisible to them, just background noise in their story about how great they were. But someone was watching. Elena Rodriguez, a quiet recruit who kept to herself most of the time, had been observing Sophia carefully for days now. There was something about the way Sophia moved, the way she handled every situation with such calm control, that didn't add up. People who got treated that badly usually fought back or broke down crying or quit altogether. Sophia did none of those things. She just kept going like she was waiting for something, like she knew something nobody else knew. Elena walked over slowly and sat down on the bunk next to Sophia's. "You okay?" she asked quietly, keeping her voice low so the others wouldn't hear. Sophia looked up, surprised that anyone was talking to her without mockery in their voice. "I'm fine," she said, continuing to bandage her palm. Elena nodded, watching Sophia's hands work with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before," Elena observed. "Treated injuries, I mean. Most people fumble with bandages their first time." Sophia paused for just a moment, then continued wrapping the bandage. "Everyone learns eventually," she said, not really answering the question. Elena studied her face, trying to read what lay behind those calm eyes. "Yeah," Elena said slowly, "but usually not before they get here." She stood up and reached in her own bag, pulling out a spare compass. "Take this," she whispered, glancing around to make sure nobody was watching. "You'll need it for tomorrow's exercise." Sophia took the compass, their fingers touching briefly. "Thanks," she said, and for the first time since arriving, something that might have been gratitude flickered across her face. The equipment distribution the next morning provided another opportunity for harassment. Recruits lined up to receive gear for the day's drill, and the supply sergeant, a gruff older man named Brooks, handed out tactical vests and helmets with barely hidden contempt for the young people under his charge. When Sophia stepped up to the counter, he looked her over like she was something unpleasant stuck to his boot. "What's this, a charity case?" he said loud enough for the entire line to hear. "We don't have gear for street kids, sweetheart." He tossed her a tactical vest that was at least 3 sizes too big, the straps dangling uselessly at her sides. The recruits behind her snickered and whispered to each other. "Maybe she can use it as a tent," one called out, prompting another wave of laughter. Sophia caught the vest, her fingers tightening around the canvas for just a moment. She didn't argue or ask for a replacement. She just slung it over her shoulder and walked out, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. But outside, away from watching eyes, Sophia adjusted the oversized vest with a few quick movements. Her hands worked with the same precision she'd shown cleaning her wounds, transforming the ill-fitting equipment into something that sat perfectly on her frame. She tied knots that military riggers would have recognized as professional grade, made adjustments that spoke of experience far beyond basic training. When she was finished, the vest looked like it had been custom-fitted. She stood there for a moment, staring at her reflection in a window, and something cold and determined settled in her expression. The rifle sat on the table in front of Sophia, its metal parts gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the training building. Instructor Davis stood at the front of the room with his arms crossed, watching as recruits filed in and took their positions behind their assigned weapons. This was the moment many of them had been waiting for, the chance to prove they knew their way around military equipment. The exercise was simple but unforgiving. Completely take apart the rifle, clean every piece, and put it back together in under 2 minutes. Most recruits would struggle. Some would fail entirely. This was the test that separated people who talked about being soldiers from people who actually had the skills. Ryan Carter went first, his fingers fumbling slightly as he worked to remove the bolt assembly. He kept glancing at the timer on the wall, sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air. When he finally snapped the last piece into place, the timer read 1 minute and 51 seconds. He grinned and pumped his fist, clearly proud of his performance. Jessica went next, her hands shaking as she tried to remember the sequence she'd studied the night before. She barely made it, finishing at 1 minute and 58 seconds with a gasp of relief. Then it was Sophia's turn. She stepped up to the table and looked down at the rifle with those same calm eyes she'd shown since arriving. She didn't crack her knuckles or take a deep breath or do any of the nervous habits the others had displayed. She just placed her hands on the weapon and began to work. Her fingers moved like they were following music only she could hear. Pin out, bolt removed, parts laid out in a perfect grid on the table. Each movement was smooth and precise. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The other recruits stopped talking and started watching. Even Ryan, who had been celebrating his own time, fell silent. Instructor Davis leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched Sophia's hands fly across the components. She cleaned each part with quick efficiency, her movements so practiced they looked almost automatic. Then she began reassembling, piece sliding into piece with soft clicks that sounded like a puzzle solving itself. When she stepped back from the table, the timer read 48 seconds. The room went completely silent. Instructor Davis walked over slowly and inspected the rifle, checking every connection, every pin, every surface. It was perfect, not a single mistake, not a single part out of place. "Chun," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Where did you learn to do that?" Sophia wiped her hands on her pants and stepped back from the table. "Training," she said, her eyes fixed somewhere past his shoulder. The training screen behind them played a slow-motion replay of her performance for everyone to see. Every movement was clean and efficient, like watching a professional demonstrate technique to beginners. A lieutenant standing nearby leaned over to Instructor Davis, his voice carrying just far enough for others to hear. Her hands didn't shake once. "That's specialist-level steady." Ryan overheard and scoffed loudly, trying to regain some of the attention he'd lost. "So she can take apart a gun," he said, making sure Sophia could hear every word. "Doesn't mean she can actually fight." But whispers had already started spreading through the group. A few recruits began glancing at her during breaks, trying to figure out how this puzzle fit together. The girl who dressed like she had nothing, who took abuse without fighting back, who seemed like the weakest person in the entire program, had just demonstrated skills that made their own abilities look amateur. The precision shooting test came 3 days later, and it carried even more weight than the rifle assembly. 5 shots at 500 yards. 5 perfect center hits required or immediate removal from the program. No second chances, no makeup tests. This was designed to break people, to find out who could handle pressure when failure meant losing everything they'd worked for. The shooting range stretched out before them, targets barely visible in the distance. Wind whipped across the open space, making flags snap and dance on their poles. These were the worst possible conditions for accurate shooting. Jessica went first, her face pale as she settled into position behind the rifle. She took her time, adjusting the scope multiple times, checking wind speed, trying to do everything by the book. Her first shot missed completely. Her second barely clipped the outer ring of the target. By the time she finished, only 2 of her 5 shots had hit anywhere near the center. She stood up with tears in her eyes, knowing what that performance meant for her future in the program. Ryan managed 4 decent hits, but his 5th shot went wide, pulled off target by a gust of wind he hadn't compensated for. He cursed under his breath and slammed his fist against the shooting platform. Then it was Sophia's turn. She approached the rifle with that same unhurried calm she brought to everything. She didn't spend time adjusting anything. Didn't take practice swings or test the wind with wet fingers held up to the breeze. She simply settled into position, her body going completely still in a way that made her look almost like a statue. The first shot rang out, echoing across the range. Perfect center hit. The second shot followed within seconds. Another perfect hit. She wasn't pausing between shots, wasn't recalculating or adjusting. She was simply firing with a rhythm that seemed impossible given the distance and conditions. The third, fourth, and fifth shots came just as quickly. All perfect center hits. The range master stared at the target display screen, then at Sophia, then back at the screen like his equipment must be malfunctioning. "Chun," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet range. "Perfect score. All 5 shots dead center." Colonel David Martinez had been observing from a covered area nearby. He was an older man with gray hair and a chest covered in ribbons and medals that spoke of decades of service. He leaned forward suddenly, his relaxed posture shifting to intense focus. "Who trained her?" he murmured to his aide, his voice barely audible but somehow urgent. The aide shook his head, looking confused. "No detailed information in her file, sir. Just says she completed basic requirements for entry." But Colonel Martinez kept staring at Sophia, his eyes narrowed like he was trying to solve a complicated problem. "That trigger control," he said quietly, "that's not something you learn in civilian programs. That's advanced training." Ryan overheard the conversation and rolled his eyes dramatically, still trying to maintain his position as the group's leader. "Lucky shots," he announced loud enough for Sophia to hear. "Wind probably just stopped at the right time. Let's see her do something that actually matters." But during the mandatory equipment inspection that followed the shooting test, the range master made a discovery that sent ice through his veins. He picked up Sophia's rifle and examined it closely, something nagging at his professional instincts. Then he saw it. The scope mounting was slightly off, creating a misalignment so subtle that most people wouldn't notice it at all. But that tiny defect should have made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Every shot fired through that rifle would naturally pull to the left and slightly down. Sophia had somehow compensated perfectly for a flaw she couldn't have known about, adjusting her aim by pure instinct and muscle memory. The range master walked over to Colonel Martinez, carrying the rifle carefully. "Sir, you need to see this," he said, showing him the misaligned scope. "She shot a perfect score with equipment that was fundamentally broken." Martinez took the rifle and examined it closely, his hands beginning to tremble slightly. He'd seen this kind of skill exactly once before in his 30-year career, in a classified program that officially didn't exist. A program that trained operatives to adapt to any situation, any equipment failure, any impossible condition. His mind raced through possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. Sophia had already walked away from the range, heading back toward the barracks like nothing unusual had happened. Elena caught up with her, slightly out of breath from jogging. "That was incredible," Elena said quietly. "I've never seen anyone shoot like that." Sophia kept walking, her face showing nothing. "Just practice," she said, using the same words she'd used after the rifle assembly. But Elena wasn't buying it anymore. "No," she said firmly. "That's not just practice. That's something else entirely. Who are you really?" Sophia stopped walking and turned to look at Elena. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been the truth trying to break through. But then her expression smoothed out again, becoming that same unreadable mask she always wore. "I'm just a recruit," she said. "Same as you." But they both knew that was a lie now. Elena nodded slowly, deciding not to push further. "Okay," she said. "But when you're ready to tell the truth, I'll listen." Sophia watched her walk away, and for the first time since arriving, she looked uncertain, like maybe staying invisible wasn't going to work much longer. The hand-to-hand combat assessment was scheduled for early afternoon, and everyone knew it would be the real test of who belonged in the program. All the shooting skills and equipment knowledge in the world meant nothing if you couldn't handle yourself in close quarters. The training mat was set up in the center of the gymnasium, surrounded by the rest of the recruits who formed a loose circle to watch. Instructor Davis stood at the edge with a clipboard, calling out names and pairings. When he reached Sophia's name, he paused for a moment, then looked up with something that might have been concern or curiosity. "Chun and Carter," he announced. The room went silent. Ryan stood up from where he'd been stretching, a predatory grin spreading across his face. He was 6'2" and built like he'd been lifting weights since childhood. Sophia looked tiny, standing across from him. her worn hoodie making her seem even smaller than she was. Jessica pulled out her phone immediately, already recording what she assumed would be an easy victory for Ryan. "This is going to be good," she whispered to the recruit next to her. Marcus started taking bets on how long Sophia would last, most people guessing less than 30 seconds. Ryan stepped onto the mat, rolling his shoulders and cracking his neck with theatrical confidence. "Nothing personal, Chun," he said, though his tone suggested it was very personal. "But this is where you learn the difference between lucky shots and actual combat." Sophia stepped onto the mat without responding, her hands hanging loose at her sides. She didn't take a fighting stance or prepare herself in any visible way. She just stood there, waiting for whatever came next. Instructor Davis raised his hand, ready to signal the start of the match, but before he could drop it, Ryan charged forward. He didn't wait for the official signal. He just grabbed Sophia's hoodie with both hands and slammed her backward into the padded wall at the edge of the mat. The impact was violent and loud, making several recruits gasp. Sophia's head snapped back and hit the padding hard enough to leave her dazed. Ryan held her pinned there, using his size and strength to keep her trapped. But as he pressed her against the wall, there was a ripping sound. The fabric of her hoodie tore from the shoulder down her arm, the old material finally giving way after days of rough treatment. The torn sleeve fell away, and suddenly everyone in the gymnasium could see what had been hidden underneath. Etched across Sophia's shoulder in stark black ink was a tattoo unlike anything they'd ever seen. A serpent coiled around a fractured skull, rendered in intricate detail that looked almost three-dimensional. The snake's eyes were hollow voids that seemed to stare out at whoever looked at them. Its fangs were bared, dripping what looked like venom or blood. But it wasn't just the artwork that made everyone freeze. It was the symbol itself, a mark that carried meaning in military circles. The laughter died in throats. Phone stopped recording. Even Ryan's grip loosened slightly as he stared at the tattoo on her skin. "What the hell is that?" he said, his confident tone cracking just slightly. Jessica's voice came from the crowd, higher pitched than normal. "Is that supposed to mean something?" But Colonel Martinez, who had been observing the training from the back of the gymnasium, moved forward with sudden urgency. His face had gone completely pale, all the color draining away in an instant. His hand was shaking, actually trembling as he walked closer to get a better look. "Who gave you permission to wear that mark?" His voice came out rough and unsteady, filled with something between fear and reverence. The entire gymnasium went silent. Even the recruits who had been talking among themselves stopped and turned to watch. Something important was happening, though most of them didn't understand what. Sophia stood there with Ryan still gripping her torn hoodie, the tattoo stark against her skin. She looked directly at Colonel Martinez, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear enough to carry across the silent room. "Shadow Serpent gave it to me," she said. "I trained under him for 7 years." The words hit everyone like a physical punch. Colonel Martinez froze completely, his eyes going wide with recognition and disbelief. Then, as if his body was moving without his permission, he straightened his spine, brought his heels together with a sharp click, and raised his hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute. His aide standing nearby gasped audibly. "Sir, what are you doing?" the aide whispered urgently. But Martinez held the salute, his voice filled with awe. "No one wears that mark unless they were chosen. Shadow Serpent only trained one student. Ever." The name meant nothing to most of the recruits. They looked at each other with confused expressions, wondering what they were missing. But to Colonel Martinez and anyone else with high-level military clearance, Shadow Serpent was more than just a name. It was a legend whispered in classified briefings. Stories of missions that never officially happened, of operatives who could slip through enemy territory like ghosts, of a training program so elite that only one person per generation was selected to complete it. Most people assumed it was just another military myth, something made up to scare enemies or impress civilians. Ryan stumbled backward, releasing Sophia and nearly tripping over his own feet. His face had gone from confident to confused to genuinely frightened in the span of seconds. "That's impossible," he said, his voice weak. Shadow Serpent was declared dead 5 years ago. Everyone knows that. Martinez finally lowered his salute, his eyes never leaving Sophia's face. Declared dead doesn't mean actually dead, he said quietly. It means someone wanted people to stop looking. He turned to face the assembled recruits, his voice gaining strength and authority. Shadow Serpent was the most elite operative in our military's history. The missions he completed are still classified above my clearance level, and I'm a colonel. Elena stepped forward from the crowd, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking together in her mind. That's why you never fought back, she said, looking at Sophia with new understanding. You weren't hiding because you were weak. You were hiding because you're dangerous. Sophia acknowledged her with a slight nod, but didn't elaborate. Jessica's phone had slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered on the gymnasium floor. Marcus looked like he might be sick, his face green as he remembered all the times he'd mocked her, pushed her, treated her like garbage. The entire group of recruits who had spent days tormenting her now stared with expressions ranging from shock to horror. But Ryan's pride wouldn't let him accept what he was hearing. The golden boy who had never lost, who had built his entire identity on being the best and strongest, couldn't process that this small, quiet girl was actually far more skilled than he could ever hope to be. I don't believe it, he said, his voice rising with desperate anger. I don't care what tattoo you have or what stories people tell. Prove it. Fight me for real. Right now. Colonel Martinez stepped forward, his voice sharp with warning. Son, I strongly suggest you reconsider that request. No, Ryan interrupted, his face flushed red with humiliation and rage. If she's so dangerous, let her prove it. He moved back into fighting position, his fists raised, muscles tense for combat. Come on, Chun. Show everyone what the great Shadow Serpent taught you. Sophia looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. The careful blankness that had protected her for days melted away, replaced by something colder and more focused. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried an edge that made everyone nearby feel suddenly uncomfortable. If that's what you want. She didn't bother fixing her torn hoodie or adjusting her stance. She just stood there with her arms at her sides, looking almost bored as Ryan began to circle her like a predator. He threw the first punch, a powerful right hook aimed at her face. Sophia moved just enough to let it whistle past her ear, not even flinching at the near miss. Ryan followed up with a left jab, then a right cross, then a combination of punches that should have overwhelmed anyone with pure speed and aggression. But Sophia wasn't there when his fists arrived. She flowed around his attacks like water, her footwork so subtle it almost looked like she was standing still while he exhausted himself hitting nothing but air. Stand still and fight, Ryan roared, his breathing becoming labored. Sophia didn't respond. She let him tire himself out, his punches getting sloppier, his movements becoming predictable. She was reading him, learning his patterns, waiting for the exact right moment. When that moment came, it happened so quickly that most people watching missed it entirely. Ryan threw another wild right hand, overextending himself in frustration. Sophia stepped inside his guard, her arms sliding around his neck in what looked almost like an embrace. There was a brief frozen moment where they seemed caught together. Then Ryan's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the gymnasium floor, unconscious before he hit the mat. 8 seconds from start to finish. The gymnasium was absolutely silent except for the sound of Ryan's body hitting the ground. Instructor Davis walked over slowly and checked Ryan's pulse, then looked up at Sophia with an expression that mixed respect with something close to fear. Colonel Martinez cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire space with absolute authority. Effective immediately, Sophia Chun is designated as an assistant instructor. You will learn from her. You will respect her, and you will follow her guidance as you would any superior officer. Sophia didn't nod or smile or acknowledge the promotion in any way. She simply bent down, picked up her torn hoodie, and began walking toward the gymnasium exit. The recruits parted before her like she was carrying something dangerous, their eyes down, their earlier mockery completely forgotten. Elena watched her go, then looked around at the faces of everyone who had tormented Sophia for days. "We're idiots," she said quietly. "All of us." Nobody disagreed. They'd learned a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their military careers. The most dangerous person in any room is often the one nobody respects.